This is the algebraic representation of what we've already been talking about. T, big T, little t is the tax rate, big T is the tax revenue. And it's the product of the tax rate and how much is demanded when people are paying the tax. The excess burden, the opportunity cost, I'm calling capital delta. It also depends on the tax rate as well as the other variables, but we're going to focus on the tax rate. It is the trapezoid minus the rectangle. The difference in cost minus the expenditure on the tax. So at zero tax rate, there's no revenue and no excess burden. That's one property, rather obvious one. The marginal excess burden, by that we mean how much do we add to the opportunity cost with a small increase in the tax rate. That has to do with the change in behavior. In particular, it's the product of the tax rate that you began with and how much behavior changes with the tax rate. My subscript P refers to the partial derivative of the Hicksian demand curve. The second derivative of the cost function, right? And that's either positive or zero. In particular, it's zero at zero tax rate. And that's a result we use a lot in price theory. We're going to use it in understanding excess burden. Murphy talks about nudges. When I talked about externality, we use that property. I think on the homework number 1, we maybe even mentioned nudges. I can't remember. Did we mention the nudge in homework number 1? Homework 2, yeah. So we've looked at that a little already. And this is another expression of the same idea. If we start with zero tax and we increase the tax a little bit from zero, there's essentially no opportunity cost from that. Because all we're doing is we're throwing some transactions out of the market. The Hicksian demand curve is sloping down. We're throwing some transactions out of the market, but those were the transactions that weren't really worth anything. That's why they go out of the markets even for a small tax. So the marginal deadweight cost at zero is zero. The marginal effect on revenue is not zero. So we have a first order, we call it a first order effect on revenue, but a second order effect on the excess burden. Okay, we've discussed these. And I mentioned the nudges. There's a whole bunch of things we do in economics. The case against central planning, comparing a volunteer and a drafted military. I don't have time to go into those things this morning, but those are all based off this sort of result. Okay. One thing that happens in this model of how people respond to taxes is that the high value units remain on the market. That's the other side of the coin, and I just said that small taxes eliminate transactions from the market that really weren't worth any much, had very little surplus. It eliminates these transactions over here that have this small gap between marginal benefit and marginal cost. As we start to increase the tax rate, we continue to eliminate transactions from the market. But now those are no longer the small surplus transactions because they're already gone. So that tends to make us, tends toward the presumption that the excess burden is convex. That the marginal excess burden increased with taxes. Now that's a presumption, not a theorem. Let's see. Oh, I should mention now here the Laffer curve. I mentioned the marginal effect of the tax rate on the tax revenue. That's also known as the slope of the Laffer curve, because the Laffer curve is the graph of the tax rate measured horizontally and the tax revenue measured vertically. And the Laffer curve has two parts of it. When I was in Washington, I hear people call it the static revenue estimate. So if this term by itself is called the static revenue because it's how much revenue would we get if we increased the tax and people didn't change their behavior. They kept their behavior at this level. So if we're selling 100 million packs of cigarettes and we raise the tax by $1, we're going to get $100 million if people continue to buy that. That's the static revenue. Now, of course, people change their behavior. So we have a second term that reflects, okay, people change their behavior. There's units leaving the market, and you lose revenue on all those. And that's the mirror of the excess burden. I've highlighted in yellow there, the marginal excess burden is one of the terms in the revenue, the Laffer curve slope. It's the static revenue effect plus, or I should say minus the marginal excess burden, because it's a negative effect. This term is never negative. Could be zero, I guess, if people are demanding nothing. And this term is never positive. The Hicksian demand curve can never slope up. Could be zero if behavior didn't change at all. Could be zero if the tax rate were at zero, which is some of what we've considered so far. So you have a positive term and a negative term. Which one dominates? And that's kind of what made Laffer helped make him famous for particular taxes in particular jurisdictions. He was arguing, the negative term is dominating. We're at a point where when we raise the tax rate, we get less revenue. That part is debatable. People debated with him then, they debate with him now. But this decomposition isn't really debated. We know there's a positive term and a negative term. We do know at small tax rates, we worked that out already, that the positive term is going to dominate. We know that part. And Laffer knew it too.